The tin cup rolled out of Elsie Maybell's cloth bundle and stopped beneath the shadow of a horse. For one sharp second, she thought Vivian had come back. She lifted her head too fast, and the Texas road swayed under the white heat. But the wagon was gone. Only its wheel marks remained, cutting away through the dust toward Eagle Pass. Vivian Claybell had not turned back. Not when Elsie called after her. Not when the canteen was taken from the wagon step. Not when Elsie fell trying to follow. Elsie's fingers closed around the one thing Vivian had not noticed. Her father's handkerchief. Jonah Bell's handkerchief still carried the faintest trace of pipe tobacco and bay rum. Though maybe that was only memory being kind. The horse above her shifted once. A man swung down from the saddle. He was broad through the shoulders, dressed in trail dark clothes, with a black hat pulled low and a face shaped by sun, dust, and years of not saying more than he had to. His horse, a dark red gelding, stood quiet behind him. The man did not rush toward her. He crouched several feet away. "Child," he said, voice low. "Can you hear me?" Elsie tried to answer. Her throat would not give her words. He unscrewed a canteen, poured water into the tin cup, and slid it across the dirt instead of putting his hands on her. "Small sips," he said. "Slow now." Elsie stared at the cup. A grown person giving something away without naming the price was not a thing she trusted. The man seemed to understand. "My name is Boone Harland," he said. "This horse is Red Jack. He has more sense than most men. And less temper." Elsie reached for the cup with shaking fingers. The first sip hurt. The second made her close her eyes. Boone waited. He did not tell her to hurry. He did not tell her to be grateful. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elsie." She whispered. "Elsie what?" "Elsie Maybell." He repeated it once. "Careful and quiet. Who left you out here?" "Miss Elsie." She looked down the empty road. Vivian had said she only needed to turn the wagon. Vivian had said Elsie should wait. Vivian had said no one would come looking. Then Elsie remembered the black strongbox under Vivian's seat. Her father's box. The one that used to stay locked in the bedroom trunk. Vivian had taken that too. "My stepmother," Elsie said. Boone's eyes moved toward the wagon tracks. "Is she coming back?" Elsie wanted to lie. A lie would have been warmer. "No, sir." Boone took off his hat and dragged one hand over his face. When he put the hat back on, his jaw had settled into something harder. "How old are you?" 13. "Sir." He closed his eyes for one breath, then opened them again. "Miss Elsie, I have a ranch west of here. Cedar Spur. There is shade, food, a clean bed, and a woman named Teresa Valdez who will fuss over you until you beg for mercy." Elsie held the cup tighter. Or I take you to the sheriff in Fort Worth. You tell him what happened, and I stand there while you say it." He kept both hands where she could see them. "That is all I am offering. Not a hand on you unless you say it. Not a mile farther than you choose." No one had asked Elsie to choose in a long time. The road stretched empty both ways. No fence. No well. No roof. No wagon dust turning back. "Why did you stop?" she asked. Boone looked at Red Jack, then at the tin cup in her hands. "I had a daughter once," he said. "Clara. She would have been near your age now." Elsie did not know what to do with that. Boone's voice roughened, but it stayed steady. "There is no road in Texas I would have passed her on." The wind moved dust over the wagon tracks until they began to blur. Elsie looked one last time toward the road Vivian had taken. Then she looked at Boone Harland. "Cedar Spur," she said. Boone nodded. I am going to lift you now. Gentle as I can. You tell me if anything hurts. She believed him. Not all the way, but enough to survive the next mile. He lifted her carefully and settled her before him on Red Jack. His arm came around her only to keep her steady. As the horse turned west, the tin cup tapped softly against the canteen in Boone's saddlebag. Elsie kept Jonah Bell's handkerchief clenched in her fist. The wagon was gone. The lie was gone with it. But for the first time since morning, someone had asked where she wanted to go. Elsie woke to the smell of bread. For one half-dreaming second, she thought she was back in her father's kitchen before everything went wrong. Before Jonah Bell took sick. Before Vivian's voice turned sweet only when trouble was coming. Then a cool cloth touched her forehead. Easy. Mia. A woman said, do not jump out of that bed unless you want me chasing you with a spoon. Elsie opened her eyes. A broad woman in a clean apron stood beside the bed. Her dark hair streaked with silver and pinned tight at the back of her head. Her face looked stern enough to frighten grown men and kind enough to make a child cry. Elsie tried to sit up. The woman pressed one hand gently to her shoulder. No. You rest. I am Teresa Valdez. I run this kitchen. Which means I run most of this house, whether Mr. Harland admits it or not. Elsie blinked. Mr. Harland. The man who brought you in. The door creaked. Boone Harland stood in the hallway. Hat in hand. His shoulders nearly filling the frame. He did not step inside. How is she? Awake. Teresa said without turning. And not yours to bother yet. Boone accepted that like a man used to being overruled by the right person. There is a bell by the bed. He said. Tell her if she rings it. Someone comes. Any hour. Any reason. I will tell her. And tell her she is safe. Teresa's face softened. But only after Boone had walked away. You hear that? She said. You ring. Somebody comes. Elsie looked at the little brass bell on the table beside the bed. She did not touch it. Not yet. Later. When the room had gone gold with evening light, a girl about Elsie's age appeared at the foot of the bed and stared at her with bright, open curiosity. You snore. The girl said. Elsie stiffened. I do not. You do. Quiet though. Like a tired kitten. The girl grinned. I am Nita. Teresa is my grandmother. She told me to watch you and holler if you stopped breathing. Elsie did not know what to say to that. Nita leaned closer. You hungry? The answer rose before pride could stop it. Yes. Downstairs. The kitchen table was set with honey biscuits, fried ham, milk, and a pot of beans. Elsie stopped in the doorway. Too much food. Too many people. Too many eyes being careful not to stare. Boone stood at the far end of the table. His hat set on the sideboard. He pulled out a chair but did not touch her. Sit. Miss Elsie. She sat. Nita slid onto the bench beside her. Close enough that their sleeves brushed. Elsie looked at the biscuit on her plate. Golden and split open. Honey shining inside. Her stomach hurt wanting it. I have nothing to pay with. She whispered. The kitchen went still. Boone's face changed. Not much. But enough. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table. There is no price on that biscuit. He said. No price on the roof. No price on the bed upstairs. You do not owe work. Thanks. Silence. Or smiles for being safe in this house. Elsie stared at him. He nodded toward her plate. Eat before Teresa starts blaming me for letting food cool. I heard that. Teresa called from the stove. Elsie took one small bite. Then another. The honey was warm. That was what broke her. She cried without sound, tears falling straight onto the biscuit. Nita did not ask why. She only pushed the milk closer. When Elsie had eaten enough to stop shaking, Boone spoke again. Softer this time. I need to ask some things. You do not have to answer all tonight. Elsie wiped her face with the back of her wrist. Yes. Sir. Your father's name. Jonah Bell. Land. Near Eagle Pass. He said it was mine when I got grown. He said, Mr. Amos, Finch had the papers. Boone's eyes sharpened. Did Vivian know that? Elsie's hands tightened in her lap. She talked about it after Pa was gone. Men came in sweet. She made me stay in the kitchen. But I heard her say the girl would not be trouble. Teresa turned from the stove. Nita stopped swinging her feet. Boone's voice stayed calm. But his hands had gone flat against the table. Is that why she left you on the road? Elsie looked at the biscuit she had not finished. She said no one would come looking. For a moment, Boone did not move. Then he stood. Read. He called toward the back hall. A tall foreman appeared almost at once. Sir. Ride with me to Eagle Pass. Quiet. Fast. We find Amos Finch before Vivian sells what is not hers. He looked back at Elsie. She will not reach you here. Not by wagon. Not by paper. Not by tears in front of a judge. She will have to pass every lawful hand on this ranch first. After Boone left, the kitchen seemed to breathe again. Elsie sat with her milk between both hands. Nita leaned close. He means it. Teresa, still facing the stove, said quietly. He had a girl once. Clara. About your age. Elsie's heart pulled tight. Am I in her chair? Teresa turned then. Eyes bright. No. Mia. Tonight, you are in yours. Elsie looked down at the honey biscuit. Then at the bell, visible through the open stairway above. For the first time, she wondered if a house could be sad and safe at the same time. Boone Harland returned from Eagle Pass with dust on his coat and no softness in his face. Elsie saw him through the kitchen window before anyone heard his boots on the porch. Red Jack came in lathered and tired. Reed Kincaid rode beside him. Hat low. Jaws set. Between them sat an old man on a narrow mule, holding a leather satchel against his chest like it carried something breakable. Teresa wiped her hands on her apron. That will be Mr. Finch, she said. Elsie stood too quickly. Nita caught her sleeve. You do not have to go out there. I know. But knowing and staying were different things. She walked to the parlor doorway and stopped where she could see without being seen too much. Mr. Amos Finch was thin as a rail, with white hair, watery eyes, and a collar that looked too tight for his neck. He stood in Boone's parlor with his hat pressed to his chest. I kept copies, Finch said. Voice dry, but steady. Jonah Bell was careful. He came to me before the fever took him proper. Said he wanted no confusion after he was gone. Boone stood by the mantel. Say it plain. Finch opened the satchel and removed a folded packet. The Eagle Pass land, house, livestock, and the bank account are held in trust for Elsie May Bell until she reaches 16. I am named trustee unless the court appoints another. Elsie gripped the doorframe. Her father had not forgotten her. He had known. And Vivian? Boone asked. Finch's mouth tightened. Jonah left her a small cash portion and his prayer book. Teresa made a sound under her breath. Boone did not move. She knew. She was present when he signed. The parlor went quiet. Finch took out another paper. 2 days after Jonah passed. Vivian came to my office with this. A later will, she claimed. It gave her everything. Was it Jonah's hand? No. Boone's voice dropped. You are certain. I knew Jonah Bell's signature for 11 years. Finch lifted his chin. That paper is false. Elsie's knees felt weak. Nita slipped beside her and put one small hand against her back. Finch continued. When I refused it, Mrs. Bell warned me that important men would rather listen to a grieving widow than an old lawyer. Boone looked toward the doorway. Elsie knew he had seen her. He did not call her out. He did not make the room turn toward her. He only said, "Then important men can learn to listen better." By the next morning, Reed brought a wire from Fort Worth. Vivian had not gone to family. She had gone north to meet a man named Dorian Vale, an investor who had spent the spring asking questions about oil-bearing land near Eagle Pass. One of those parcels sat inside Jonah Bell's claim. Boone read the telegram twice. She did not just want the land. Reed said, "No." Boone answered. She wanted the girl gone before the land was questioned. Elsie heard it from the hallway. The girl. That was what Vivian had called her. But in Boone's house, the words sounded different now. Not like erasing. Like evidence. For 6 days, Cedar Spur moved like a ranch, preparing for weather. Finch wrote statements. Boone sent copies of the true will to Fort Worth. Reed rode with sealed letters. Sheriff Hank Rourke came once and left with his face grim. Teresa kept Elsie fed. Nita slept on a pallet beside her bed without asking permission. Then the newspaper arrived. Teresa brought it into the kitchen, folded tight in both hands. "Patron," she said. Boone took it. He read 3 lines. His face went hard. Elsie stood by the stove. "Is it about me?" Boone lowered the paper. He looked like he wanted to say no. Then he set the paper on the table between them. "Yes." Elsie read slowly. She knew enough words to understand the shape of it. A wealthy rancher. A missing child. A grieving stepmother. A house no one from town had entered. Her stomach turned cold. She is saying, "You took me." She is trying to make people look at me instead of the papers. Boone said, "Will they believe her?" "Some will." That honesty frightened her. But it also steadied her. A rider came before noon with court papers. Vivian had filed for custody, recovery of property, and an order against Boone Harland. The hearing was set for Friday in Fort Worth. That night, Boone sat with Elsie in the parlor. Teresa stood behind her chair. Nita sat on the floor by the hearth, hugging her knees. Boone held his hat in both hands. "Miss Elsie," he said, "the judge may ask to hear from you." Elsie could barely breathe. "With Vivian there?" "Yes." "Will you speak for me?" Boone's eyes softened. "No," he said. "But I will stand where you can see me. And if your words run off, you look at me until they come back." Elsie looked down at her hands. She thought of the road. The tin cup. The wagon that never turned. Then she nodded once. "If he asks," she whispered, "I will tell him." Fort Worth Courthouse was full before the bell struck 9. Elsie had never seen so many hats in one room. Ranchers stood along the back wall. Town women whispered behind gloved hands. Reporters sat with pencils ready, their eyes moving from Boone Harland to the small girl beside Teresa Valdez. Vivian Clay Bell sat at the front table dressed in black. She had a black veil pinned to her hat, a black-edged handkerchief in her hand, and tears ready whenever someone looked her way. Elsie felt her stomach tighten. Vivian did not look like the woman who had left her on the road. She looked like someone's poor widow. That was the worst part. Boone stood behind Elsie's chair, not touching her. Mr. Amos Finch sat at the table with his papers stacked in careful order. Teresa sat in the first row behind them. Nita sat beside her, fists clenched in her lap. Judge Milton Cade entered, and the room rose. When everyone sat again, Vivian's lawyer stood first. He spoke smoothly, like a man pouring syrup over rot. He called Elsie a troubled child. He called Vivian a grieving widow. He called Boone Harland a lonely cattleman whose grief had made him reckless. A wealthy man, the lawyer said, turning so the reporters could hear, took a child from the road, kept her at his isolated ranch, and refused her lawful guardian access. A murmur moved through the room. Elsie's hands twisted in her lap. Boone did not move. Then Mr. Finch stood. He was old, dry-voiced, and not impressive to look at. But when he placed Jonah Bell's true will on the table, the room changed. Jonah Bell came to my office before his passing. Finch said. He placed his land, house, livestock, and bank account in trust for Elsie May Bell until her 16th birthday. Vivian dabbed at her eyes. Finch looked straight at the judge. Mrs. Bell was present when he signed it. The handkerchief stopped moving. Finch then produced the second paper. The document Mrs. Bell later brought me was false. It was not Jonah Bell's signature. The reporters began writing faster. Sheriff Hank Rourke testified next. He spoke of the wagon tracks, the missing canteen, the rail ticket, and the strongbox Vivian had taken from the Bell house. Then Dorian Vale took the stand. His collar looked too tight. His face shone under the courtroom lamps. I was led to believe Mrs. Bell controlled the Eagle Pass parcel. He said, when I learned the land belonged to the child, I withdrew. Vivian turned her face away. For the first time, she looked less like a widow and more like a woman watching a door close. Judge Cade leaned forward. The court will hear from the child. Elsie went cold from head to toe. Boone stepped around her chair and held out his hand. Palm up. Not pulling. Not commanding. Waiting. Elsie stood. The walk to the witness chair felt longer than the road outside Eagle Pass. Her shoes sounded too loud. Her breath sounded too small. She climbed onto the chair. Her feet did not touch the floor. The judge looked at her gently. Miss Bell, I will ask you one question. Take your time. Elsie nodded. Your stepmother says you ran away and that she searched for you. Is that true? The room went silent. Vivian lifted her veil. Her eyes found Elsie's. For a moment, Elsie was back in the wagon. Hearing that soft voice say no one would come looking, her throat closed. Then she looked past Vivian. Boone stood at the table, hat in both hands. He did not mouth words. He did not nod. He only looked back at her like he had promised. If your words run off, you look at me until they come back. Elsie took one breath. No. Sir, she said. The judge's pen stopped. Elsie's voice shook once, then held. She did not lose me. She left me behind. No one moved. Not the reporters. Not the ranchers. Not even Vivian. Then Vivian stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. That child is confused. Judge Cade struck the bench. Mrs. Bell. Sit down. She has been coached. Sit down. She is mine. Elsie flinched. Boone took one step, then stopped himself. Judge Cade's voice hardened. Mrs. Bell. One more outburst, and you will wait outside this courtroom. Vivian's face changed. The tears were gone. That was when the room finally saw her. The judge removed his spectacles and set them on the bench. This court denies the custody petition. The recovery petition is denied. The order against Mr. Harland is denied. Elsie could barely hear over her own heartbeat. Judge Cade continued. Temporary guardianship of Elsie Maybell is granted to Boone Harland of Cedar Spur Ranch, pending further hearing. The matter of the false document and related conduct will be referred to the district attorney. The gavel came down. Elsie climbed down from the witness chair. Boone did not rush to her. He let her walk the whole distance on her own. When she reached him, he opened his hand at his side. Elsie slipped her small hand into his. Outside. The reporters shouted questions. Boone did not answer one. He only guided Elsie through the crowd, put her safely into the carriage, and waited until the door was shut before speaking. Miss Elsie, he said, voice rough. That was the bravest truth I ever heard. Elsie looked down at their joined hands. I almost forgot the words. But you did not. No, she whispered. The carriage rolled toward Cedar Spur. And this time, when dust rose behind them, Elsie knew no one was leaving her in it. Cedar Spur did not celebrate loudly when Elsie came home. That helped. There were no cheers when the carriage rolled into the yard. No music. No crowd pressing close. Just Teresa standing on the porch with Nita beside her. Reed Kincaid near the hitching rail. Rafael Ortega by the corral fence. And half a dozen ranch hands lined quiet as fence posts. Boone stepped down first. Then he turned and held out his hand. Elsie took it. Her legs felt weak after the courthouse. But she walked across the yard herself. No one rushed her. No one grabbed her. No one asked what Vivian had looked like when the judge ruled. Teresa opened her arms. Elsie walked into them. The old cook held her close and said only, Bienvenida a casa. Mia. Welcome home. That night, Elsie slept in the clean bed, with Nita curled on a quilt pallet beside her. The little brass bell sat on the table within reach. Elsie woke twice and looked at it. She did not ring, but knowing she could was its own kind of rest. The days after court were strange because nothing terrible happened. No one told her she ate too much. No one counted the biscuits. No one called her ungrateful. No one used a sweet voice before saying something cruel. Elsie waited for the trick. 2 days passed. Then a week. The trick did not come. What came instead were small things. Teresa took Elsie's gray dress, mended the hem, then looked at it for a long while. That afternoon, she fed it into the kitchen stove and laid 2 blue cotton dresses on the bed. A note sat on top. For a girl starting over. Elsie touched the dresses like they might vanish. Nita taught her how to feed bottle calves without letting them knock the pail out of her hands. Raphael taught her how to sit a horse without gripping the reins like a rope over a cliff. Suave. Niña, he said. A horse knows fear. Ask gentle. And she listens gentle. At supper, Boone sat at the head of the long table every evening at 6. Teresa set down beans, bread, meat, and coffee. Reed came in from the bunkhouse. Raphael said grace. Nita sat close enough to bump Elsie's elbow. For the first time since Jonah Bell passed, Elsie ate where no one was angry. On the 4th Sunday, Boone came into the kitchen with a brown paper package under one arm. Teresa, he said. When is Miss Elsie's birthday? Teresa's spoon stopped in the stew. Elsie looked down. I do not rightly know. Sir. Boone turned to her. Spring sometime, she said. Pa knew. After he was gone. Vivian said birthdays were foolish. Teresa set the spoon down very carefully. Nita's mouth fell open. Boone looked toward the window for a moment. When he looked back, his voice was even. Then next Saturday will do. For what? Elsie asked. for any birthday that got missed. The next Saturday, Elsie came downstairs and found a cake on the table. Cake for breakfast. Nita whispered. He made that law this morning. I heard that. Boone said. I meant you to. There were small packages too. A ribbon. Riding gloves. A book of pressed Texas wildflowers. A folded paper giving her a chestnut filly named Sunflower. And last, a silver locket. Elsie opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of Jonah Bell. Her father's face looked back at her. Tired and kind, and not lost after all. How? She whispered. Mr. Finch had it in the file. Boone said. I had it set small enough to carry. Elsie cried hard then. No one told her to stop. Later that month, Miss Eliza Fair came from Fort Worth with slates and primers. Elsie held the chalk like it might be taken away. Miss Fair only smiled. Well, Miss Bell, she said. Shall we begin? By the 8th week, Elsie could read a full passage at supper. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Boone stood, walked into his office, and shut the door. Through the crack, Teresa saw him sit at the desk, take out a fresh paper, and write the words, Permanent Adoption Petition. Then he stopped. He set the pen down. He looked toward the kitchen, where Elsie was laughing softly with Nita over a missed word. Boone folded his hands on the desk and waited. This time, he would ask her first. Boone Harland did not file the adoption papers that night. He kept them in his desk drawer for 3 days. Each morning, he opened the drawer, looked at the folded petition, and shut it again. Teresa noticed. Reed noticed. Even Nita noticed, though she only whispered to Elsie. Mr. Boone is walking around like he swallowed a horseshoe. On the 4th evening, after supper, Boone asked Elsie to stay at the table. Teresa took Nita into the pantry, though both of them listened badly from behind the door. Boone sat across from Elsie with his hat in both hands. Miss Elsie, he said, I need to ask you something before I ask any judge. Elsie straightened. Boone pushed a paper across the table. But not all the way. I would like to petition the court for permanent adoption. That means the law would say, you are my daughter. But I will not put your name on that paper unless you want it there. Elsie looked at the paper. Her throat tightened. If I say no, Boone answered at once. Then you still stay here. You still have your room, your place at this table, your lessons, your horse, and every lawful protection I can give you. Nothing changes except the paper does not get filed. Elsie's fingers went to the silver locket at her throat. What about my pa? Jonah Bell stays your father. Boone said. His name stays in your name. His picture stays in your locket. His land stays protected for you. Not for me. I am not asking to erase him. What are you asking? Boone swallowed once. I am asking if there is room for another father beside him. For a long moment, Elsie could hear only the kitchen clock. Then she slid the paper closer. Yes, she whispered. Boone closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were shining. Elsie looked down at the paper again. Can I call you Pa Boone? His breath caught. Yes, ma'am, he said. Voice rough. I would be honored. The adoption hearing was held 2 weeks later in Fort Worth, in a smaller courtroom than the first one. No reporters crowded the walls. No Vivian in black. No lawyer spilling lies over polished words. Judge Abigail Stone sat behind the bench with kind eyes and a plain gray dress. Mr. Amos Finch was there with the trust papers. Boone had already signed a statement saying Elsie's inheritance would remain hers alone. Judge Stone read it carefully. "Mr. Harland," she said, "this adoption gives you parental duty. It gives you no claim over Jonah Bell's trust, land, or account." Boone nodded. "That is how it should be." The judge looked at Elsie. "Miss Bell, do you understand what Mr. Harland is asking?" "Yes, ma'am." "And did anyone make you agree?" "No, ma'am." "If you had said no, would you still have been allowed to remain safe at Cedar Spur?" Elsie looked at Boone. He did not nod. He did not help. He only stayed. "Yes, ma'am," Elsie said. "He told me the table was mine either way." Judge Stone's face softened. "Then tell me in your own words. What makes Boone Harland your father?" Elsie turned the locket once between her fingers. "My first pa gave me my name," she said. "Pa Boone gave me a place to say it without being afraid." The courtroom went quiet. Then she added, softer, "He did not make me earn a place at his table. He gave me one, and waited until I believed it was mine." Judge Stone's eyes shone, but her voice stayed steady. "Petition granted. Elsie May Bell shall now be recorded as Elsie May Bell Harland. The Bell Trust remains protected. No future claim by Vivian Clay Bell may reach this child without order of this court." The gavel came down. Bell first. Harland added, "Nothing lost. Something found." When they returned to Cedar Spur, Teresa had supper waiting. Nita had tied a blue ribbon around Elsie's chair. Raphael stood by the stove, pretending not to wipe his eyes. Reed shook Boone's hand once, hard, and said nothing at all. But Boone had one more thing to do. He took down the old wooden sign above the kitchen side table. "Staff table." Then he handed Elsie a new one. The letters were simple, carved deep. "Home table." Elsie held it with both hands. Boone lifted the hammer. "Where do you want it?" She pointed above the long pine table. "There." He drove in the first nail. Then he stopped and handed her the hammer. Elsie looked at it. "You sure?" Boone stepped back. "It is your table too." So Elsie tapped in the second nail herself. Not hard. Not perfect. But enough to hold. Then she went upstairs and came back with the old tin cup from the road. She placed it on the kitchen shelf beside the brass bell. Teresa pressed a hand over her mouth. Boone watched silently. Elsie touched the cup first. "This reminds me, I was found." Then she touched the bell. "This reminds me somebody comes." Boone took off his hat. Elsie looked at him. Then at the table. Then at every face in the kitchen. "Can we eat now?" Pa Boone. For the first time in 3 years. Boone Harland smiled without it hurting. "Yes, daughter," he said. "We can eat." Outside. Evening settled over Cedar Spur Ranch. Inside. At the home table. Elsie May Bell Harland opened her primer, ran one finger beneath the letters, and read her new name aloud. Bell first. Harland after. And this time, no one in the room. Let either name disappear. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.